Hello and thank you, graduating design students and future and current competitors for this invitation. Alice asked me to talk about three things. What issues I think graduating design critics might write about. Secondly, where and how should you do this writing? And thirdly, the big one, how does one get paid for doing so? The first question is rather easy. You should write about humanity's new place in a catabolically challenged world and the kinds of future that await us. By catabolically challenged, I mean the complex, connected, and high entropy world that we're in now, in this room, in this town, the one which can't possibly be sustained in the long term. Why? Because it depends on perpetually growing throughputs of energy and resources that are simply not going to be available in the long term. The True Cost campaign calls our economy a doomsday machine. We strive after infinite growth in a world whose carrying capacity is finite. The better the economy performs, faster growth, higher GDP, the faster we degrade the biosphere, which is the basis of life and our only home. It's madness, and the world is waking up to the fact that it's madness. The trouble is that no society in history has ever been able to reduce its consumption of resources voluntarily over the long term. On the contrary, as one of the many great American writers that inspires my work, Joseph Tainter, has explained, as the problems of a complicated society emerge, tackling them, confronting them requires more complexity and more resources, just as the resources start to become harder to obtain. Another word for that slightly convoluted sentence is overshoot, used by all sorts of ecological and environmental writers. But it's not, it's a slow motion kind of overshoot. It's not like a mouse running off a cliff and heading downwards like in one of the Disney cartoons. That's the kind of melodramatic overshoot that some more apocalyptic writers would have us believe is happening now. It's more like a kind of goods wagon rattling down a mountain, bouncing over the rocks, shedding goods and vital parts along the way. Anyone traveling in Europe a couple of weeks ago when the volcano blew probably has a better idea than most about what that kind of downward journey feels like. John Michael Greer, another one of my muses, wrote a book called The Long Descent, A User's Guide to the End of the Industrial Age. Greer's account of how our high entropy society will degrade slowly and unevenly over many decades is, I think, pretty convincing. For one thing, based on his and other people's study, that's how the Maya, the Roman Empire, and all other civilizations have declined, slowly and unevenly through time. The decline of a civilization is rarely anything like so sudden for those who lived through it, writes Greer. It's not what it looks like in retrospect, a clear, dramatic event that people can write books about, the kind that I was taught at school. I had a big fat book called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by a man called Gibbon, who had the whole thing sorted in 400 closely argued pages. No, for Greer, what's facing us is a much slower and more complex transformation than the sudden catastrophes imagined by social critics today and historians at other times. Now, as a story idea, catabolic collapse, or for that matter, overshoot, or the end of civilization we know it, are somewhat abstract, and I can tell you myself, may not have a ready market. Besides, we're too late. Filmmakers and game designers have already made the social Armageddon space their own. No, the stories that do need to be written, the ones that cry out for your and my attention, are the many different ways in which the new and the better are being born from the ruins of the old. Now, by new and better, I do not mean the happy, clappy, bright green optimism that we've been subjected to from some quarters in recent times. Please let's not kid ourselves that we can design or pre-design a smooth transition using positive energy, clear thinking, and green technology. Realists like Greer and Tainter, and another man that you'll be hearing more of called Clive Hamilton, an Australian who's written another rather sobering book called Requiem for a Species, they all say that based on what happened in the past, we cannot anticipate the shape of the future that awaits us, not in any detail, but we can be pretty damn sure that there will be violent moments during this long interaction of events. I didn't spill water into the house computer, I didn't. But we're not going to know what those changes are going to mean. So this notion of adaptation, which you're beginning to hear about, we should adapt to climate change. And I spent 15 years of my life in the Netherlands where they have a whole infrastructure of people whose job it is to determine how high the dikes should be, for example. That's a nice, neat engineering, planning concept of preparing for the future. Well, we need to make the dikes 2 meters high. The problem is, we don't know exactly, or even remotely, how the impacts of climate change will be on sea level, never mind all the other different aspects of life. We need to prepare for things that we cannot know, which in environmental circles, and for that matter in engineering, is a condition called adaptive resilience, which I think is one of 2 buzzwords I will use in my 30 minutes. So what Greer describes is decades of muddling through what he calls scarcity industrialism, in which we steadily liquidate, as we're doing now, what remains of the planet's oil endowments and fossil fuels and other non-renewable physical resources. This phase, for Greer, will morph into what he describes as a salvage society, when, having depleted all the easily obtained stuff, we turn to the ruins of cities and infrastructures for materials that we can no longer make afresh. And I have to say that hearing Federico's talk this morning and my own travels, that this notion of scarcity and industrialism is something which is alive and well throughout the world in the favelas and shanty towns that people very often regard as problem areas, but which are also the source of a tremendous amount of understanding and inspiration about how we are going to cope when we start to reuse salvage materials rather than cooking them all up from scratch. And there's a fabulous project in Sao Paulo called Monumento, in which some people called Co-Loco are refurbishing an entire abandoned bank building, which has been, the bank has disappeared by some tragedy. And the mayor of Sao Paulo has 3,000 empty office buildings on his hands. And he said, let's make a test case of how we refurbish and reuse an existing office building for use to people to live in, to work in, to grow food in, and so on. So that is an example of where salvage industrialism is already being practiced, not just at the fringes of society, but in the center of what we heard this morning was one of the major economic forces of the world. Going to Brazil, I go a lot more to India, reminds me that a lot of the things we describe as futures are actually happening already somewhere else. And this experience of going and being in cultures where they have never experienced material superfluity, such as India, that I've become habituated to looking at things like products or buildings, not just as forms, but as energy, and embodied energy at that. Energy that had a cost before it was made, which you know, most of you I'm sure, this notion of the embodied energy of products, something that the rucksack, the invisible rucksack of a product that makes it so much more heavy in our world than it might look. But in poor, inverted commas, developing societies, embodied energy also represents potential. Somebody has blast furnace an iron girder, they've built the concrete, so lacking the energy and the money to build them from new, how can they be reused? It's also on the basis of my experience in materially poor cultures that I've acquired a habit of being unable to look at a paved surface without having a kind of wish to dig it up. Probably think it's very sad, but de-paving is to me liberating the earth. It's something I've learned from being with activists and poor people where they do not have access to large acres of land in the countryside. Urbanism means liberating tillable ground, and so depaving is a kind of act of rebellion and acquisition in a way that we don't really understand here yet. But just walking around New York the last couple of days, I just want to dig up a lot of these massive quantities of concrete which are being put to no good use. What I'm talking about here is a way of looking at the world through a fresh lens. It's not a list of story ideas in the traditional sense. Rather than look, as we have done for 200 years, at a world and think about extraction and consumption, it's about looking for ways to preserve, steward, and restore assets, human and natural ones, that already exist. Now, designers do have an important contribution to make here. Not much more, in my opinion, as the creators of new products and buildings, or for the matter of communications. But designers are fantastic when they cast fresh and respectful eyes on a situation to reveal material and cultural qualities and values that might not be obvious to those who live there. This kind of regenerative design reimagines the built world not as a landscape of frozen objects, as we heard about in 2 or 3 presentations this morning, but on the contrary, as a complex of interacting, codependent ecologies: energy, water, food, and so on. And if anybody wants to kind of read about how the developing world is now informing planning theory at this level of natural ecologies, a man called Nabil Hamdi has written a very wonderful book called Small Change, which I, again, heartily commend. New perceptions, new ethics. What I experience in multiple contexts is an ethical framework that is pretty easily stated. It's easily stated because a man called Aldo Leopold first said something along these lines in 1947. An unconditional respect for life and for the conditions that support life. Acknowledging the biosphere as a systemic whole in which human beings are a co-dependent part. Now, you may argue that this is to state the obvious, that of course you respect life and the conditions that support life. But I stress the word unconditional. If a commitment is unconditional, it does not mean take account of, or pay due respect to, or move steadily towards. It does not mean minimize the adverse effects we have on nature. It means a target and a commitment of no adverse effects on nature. It's beautifully put by a man called Gunther Pauli, who's a biomimic, amongst many things. He says, a thief who tells a judge he is stealing less than before will receive no leniency. So why on earth do companies get environmental awards for polluting less, even though they are still polluting? I think it's a rather pointed and difficult question. So Gunther Pauli is, for me, one of the triggers about the period we're in now, away from a general awareness raising and a kind of moving beyond this absurd notion, when you think about it, of the do less bad school of environmentalism. What Pauli demands, and what the biomimics and the economic kind of fellow travelers are talking about, is an economy based on net positive impact. That's to say, economic activity in which the demands placed on the environment are met without reducing the capacity of the environment to provide for future generations, and which indeed improves its capacity to support life, improves, restores, makes better than it was before. More simply stated, leave the world better than you found it. Now, that kind of economy may sound fanciful, but it's actually happening out there and now. Between the technology will fix it dreamers on the one side and the head for the hills and a pickup truck filled with guns and peanut butter on the other side, a third and much bigger but less visible global movement is growing. This movement is united in a shared purpose. I'm using Paul Hawkins' words here, the preservation and restoration of life on Earth. It's a movement which, in his estimation, is 1 million organizations or more, but as he and I would both say, it's pretty invisible in the public awareness and media generally. It's not so easy to see from the lobby of the Ace Hotel in Manhattan. It's not particularly easy to see from this black box, but I'm just making a statement that out there a lot is happening, which I think transforms the way we think about this evolution. This movement is evident wherever people are growing food in cities, opening seed banks, or turning school backyards into edible gardens. The movement includes people who are restoring ecosystems and watersheds. Their number includes dam removers, wetland restorers, and wet rainwater rescuers. Many people in this movement are recycling buildings, as I mentioned just now, in downtowns and in suburbs, in favelas and in slums. So-called slack space activists work alongside computer recyclers, hardware bricoleurs, office block refurbishers, and trailer park renewers. You'll find the movement wherever people are launching local currencies. Non-money trading models are cropping up like crazy all over the place, 9,000 examples in a recent study. In their version of a non-cash virtual economy, 70 million Africans are now trading value using airtime on their mobile phones, bypassing totally the formal banking system. Thousands of groups, tens of thousands of experiments. For every daily life support system that is unsustainable now, food, health, shelter and clothing, alternatives are being innovated. But the key word here is social innovation, because this movement is about groups of people innovating together. It's not about lone inventors sitting in laboratories behind one-way mirrors. I'm particularly inspired by a subset of this movement called the transition towns. Transition initiatives, as they're called, they only started 2.5, 3 years ago, are multiplying at extraordinary speed. More than 250 communities in Europe and North America have been officially designated transition towns, or cities, or districts. There's even a transition forest. And the transition model, I'm quoting their website, and I quote, emboldens communities to look peak oil and climate change squarely in the eye. The key point is that they don't just look. What they do is break down this big, scary, abstract picture, the end of civilization, catabolic collapse and so on, into bite-sized chunks. Transition groups create a community-level to-do list with an order of priorities. This list describes the skills and resources that the community will need to cope with the challenges coming down the track, however unknown they might be. How these skills will be put in place and who will do what. The transition model is powerful because it brings together people from a single geographical area. These people, of course, have different interests, agendas, and capabilities, but they are united in being dependent on and committed to the context in which they live. The second reason a transition model is so powerful is that it uses a process of setting agendas and priorities, the open space method and variations thereof, that is genuinely inclusive of all points of view. So, I could talk at great length, but I'm not. I'm halfway through because I want to come to part B. The second question Alice put me concerns the modes of critical practice available to the design critic today. So when I received her email, I was busy, where I live in France, determining to put a bit of practical experience into my life in the form of growing tomatoes seriously rather than haphazardly as I've done in the past. And we have an allotment garden, and around us are a whole bunch of different cultures and nationalities who have different ways of growing different kinds of vegetables. And I decided not to pretend to have any originality, but to copy Pedro, my neighbor. So Pedro has a rather elaborate but very beautifully kind of design-looking structure made out of bamboo that we cut off the river. And so I stood there and looked for quite a long time at how it was put together. And I thought, right, this is not so complicated. So I went to the river. I cut 60 bits of bamboo, free, very nice, very bio. And I recreated more or less that sort of structure, which is basically what the tomato plant will grow up to as they develop. Then I put in 60 tomato plants in the rows, and I thought, fantastic, I'm off-grid, everything is going to be all right. Until I tried to water the tomato plants. And we have past our gardens we have a canal, and what happens is you open a kind of pipe, and water floods into the garden and waters everything automatically. It certainly waters Pedro's automatically, but mine, as I looked, I realized that my tomato sort of bed was 1 foot above the level of the water. Meaning two things. One is that I had looked at the kind of form and structure of his idea, but had not actually taken part in the gravity-fed watering that is the key to the whole exercise. And the other thing is that I'm now going to have to spend the next 3 or 4 months carrying buckets of water to manually water these plants, which is pretty much against the whole point of the exercise. Why do I tell you about my incompetence as yet another piece of incompetence in tomato growing? It's because perception and understanding of these life-critical things is embodied and situated. And we heard Peter Hall talking this morning about everybody from philosophers to people, Lucy Suchman, talking about this exact fact that you cannot describe all knowledge perfectly using indirect means. This goes for writing too. Where you write is as important as what you write. Where you are from is often as interesting as what you have to say. Place gives a writer strength as much as it gives natural system strength. Indeed, I'm pretty sure that disconnect from place and context is one of the reasons that our global man-made systems are so vulnerable. They are attenuated, they are hyper-connected, and they are interdependent, but they're automated to the extent that they have no resilience at all. The systems that we rely on, which we think are kind of external, like food systems, are fundamentally social systems. They're not technical systems. But we've spent the last 100 years resolutely trying to take people out of the picture when it comes to the systems that we now find that we depend on. Food is the obvious example. We'll just think again about what one rather small volcano did to the global travel system last week. So my suggestion about where to write as a kind of starting point is to select the bioregion of your choice as your patch. A bioregion is defined by its interconnections and interdependence. It's an ideal context in which to explore what codependency with place for people and with nature can mean. Many bylines in the media generally, but certainly in design and architecture, tend to just say, will have things like, the writer is London-based or Tokyo-based. My reaction when I see that these days is, so? Think how different it would be to describe yourself as a Central Valley bioregion-based writer, if you're from that part of California. I don't know if many of you from New Jersey, but you could, if you're from New Jersey, you could say, I'm a Hudson Valley watershed-based writer. I'm half-minded to move to Norway, because there I could be a writer based in the Caledonian Buckling. Me, if I don't move, I'm a writer based in the Stepic bioregion, formerly known as Southwest France. Alice also asked me to say something about the proliferation of channels that we now have to choose from. But here I'm going to be, I hope, provocative again, and to say that the transition to sustainability, whatever that means, is not about messages transmitted in different ways. It's about activity. It's not about proclamations. It's about practices. Now, the problem is that a big proportion of professional designers are in the representation business. So their default response in recent times has been to design a poster about sustainability, or maybe a website filled with green things to do or to buy. But projecting signals into an already cluttered environment is like throwing confetti into a snowstorm. Advertising people, of course, respond to this, what they call a clutter problem, by adding to it. But it's not just ad men who are the problem. Social media, I'm going to out-fogey Peter Hall here, I think they're part of the clutter problem too. Online communications are a mode of publication, not of conversation. And I can prove this with statistics. The number of bloggers is growing at 35% a year, but the number of people using the internet is only growing at 10% a year. You do the maths. Emitting messages, however clever and evocative they may be, is not the same as being with real people in real places who are changing their material reality. That's why I have this radical proposal for you. Consider speaking your words in a place rather than pressing send. Even Illich believed that our culture started to go off the rails in 1120, when monks stopped reading texts aloud to each other, and became solitary scholars. Now, when I first read those words of Illich 20 years ago, I thought the guy's nuts. Later, when he came to our conference, Doors of Perception, and I met him in purpose, I listened a bit harder. Embodied, situated, and unmediated communication, he explained, was the norm before we invented writing and later mass media, and I guess if he was still alive, he would say, and social media too. Barely 3 generations ago, 1 out of 10 words that a man had heard when he reached the age of 20 were words spoken to him directly, one-to-one, or as a member of the crowd, by somebody who he could touch and feel and smell. And we heard about smell this morning. It's crucial. By the 1970s, when most of you were being born, I guess, that proportion had been reversed. About 9 out of 10 words heard in the day of somebody in 1970 were spoken through a loudspeaker, and latterly received through communication networks. For Illich, there was a huge difference between a colloquial tongue, what people say to each other in a context, with a body, with meaning, and a language uttered, mediated by technology. When someone that we trust tells us to our face that a thing is important, we pay attention. That's why conversation is a more powerful medium for provoking change than pre-packaged messages projected us through media. Conversation matters more than content. Now, out there in the bioregion, and especially amongst transition towns groups, which I have with quite a bit, this face-to-face mode is key. And to me, this is not like a scientific survey, but here you have, for the first time in my professional life in 25 years, people who say they do not wish to be kept away from each other by screens. So, in my opinion, this is the most powerful and dynamic social movement happening out there at the moment. And for these people, which are of all ages, the screen, the phone, the device are means to face-to-face, not its substitute. So the transition model, as I said, it's not about messages, it's about activity. And the tools that they seek to use are tools that help them to do activity together in a place. How am I doing? I've got 5 minutes. I'm going to skip that. Okay. How do I get paid? Part 3. You're going to walk out when I get to that bit. So I think I've given you some terrific story leads. The catabolic collapse of industrial civilization, that should fill a few columns. The design agenda for a salvage society, and the replacement of our doomsday machine economy with a solidarity or social economy. I've also given you some unasked for advice about where and how to do your writing. Make a bioregion your patch rather than a city. Make a virtue of the spoken word and your embodiment in a place rather than doing everything indirectly. But Alice's third and final request was more grounded. Would I please point to some areas of hope in these students' future careers, which I take to be a polite way of saying, how does a design critic get paid these days? Now, some years ago, when the dot-com collapse was in full, gory progress, I was at a conference with a man called Eric Spiekermann, who some of you may have heard of. He's a well-known typographer and designer in Germany. And Eric stood up at this design conference and showed us exquisite work that he had done for blue-chip cultural and business clients, such as the German railways or the Berlin Underground. And we were duly impressed. But then a young design student stood up and said, well, it's all very well for you, Mr. Spiekermann. You're famous, you can cherry-pick the clients that you want to work with, and they have to pay whatever you ask. But I'm young, said the student. I'm unknown, and the economy is collapsing and going down the drain. What am I supposed to do? And I've never forgotten the way that Eric stood up and said, you're right, but I have to tell you a few truths about my glamorous, effortless life. And he went on to talk about the dog food packaging and the sleazy retail environments and the jobs that he did very below the radar to pay for his office and for his otherwise glamorous life as a famous designer. And his candor then sort of triggered me to be a bit straight with you today, with some reality checks about the degree to which I have got it made and how you can make it. Because I am still on the make. It's no easier for me to make a living today than it was 40 years ago when I first published My first text when I was 16 years old, if I've done the maths right. In my capacity as a portfolio worker doing various bits and pieces, I'm earning far less now than I was up until 2007. I do not have a magical solution to the crisis that we're in, and I absolutely don't expect it to disappear. Third reality check, I think I'm paid for, at the very most, 25% of the hours that I work. This is like work professional hours. I don't get paid for writing my blog. I don't get paid for writing my newsletter. I don't get paid for organising doors of perception events. I don't get paid, except the odd cup of tea, for going to universities and design schools. Fourth reality check, I do get paid to give talks to industry events in my capacity as an expert on whatever. This is my kind of Eric Spiekerman moment. I'm actually not ashamed of the fact that I go to industry events where they're looking to be kind of buoyed up and stimulated and hang with people, because I actually learn more from them than I do at most design events. I went to the European Carton Makers Association, and I said, you have to stop using cartons, it's destroying the planet, and by the way, here are some ideas about how to do that. I won't be invited back, but they were very happy to have that conversation. I do other work in my portfolio as an event producer, a bit like a film producer, only for festivals and meetings in different places. In this part of my portfolio, my work, my clients have tended to be city or regional governments. And I've done projects like Dotto 7 in England or City Ecolab in France, which have been timely, popular, well received, and incredibly hard to reproduce. It's almost impossible to get cities and regional government agencies, I'm talking mostly about Europe now, to fund such things in the present climate, and the present climate is the new reality. So that big part of my portfolio and my having got it made as a producer, hard to do. So I know I promised, if you read the blurb, revelations about the money thing, and I delivered perhaps more of a cold shower. But I want to finish by just telling you what keeps me going and why I love what I do, even though I still have not figured out how to make a sustainable living out of it. Firstly, how many times have we all heard there's no time to think in modern society? What writers and event organisers like us can do is to provide that reflection that is missing from everybody's lives. If you're going to write, you're going to absolutely, as we've heard several people say, you're going to have time to think. Secondly, the notion of the long view. What can a writer do except look at different time scales as a service to his or her readers or to her companions? There's even a kind of social agenda, this awful word, adaptive resilience. That, as anybody in the government or policy area will know, is a very open book that needs to be written and rewritten continuously. So there's a need, there's a demand, there's a hunger in the world for people to think outside the box, longer term, looking at things through fresh eyes, looking at assets that people take for granted. All that is a valuable and vital part of what our journey is going to be about. And in other times of crisis and profound change, those sorts of activities have had formal labels. In revolutionary Russia, they had people called worker correspondents who traveled around the countries looking at how people were reorganizing workplaces and other aspects of everyday life. In Depression-era United States, the agricultural extension services were staffed by quite a lot of intellectuals and writers who had no other means to support, but their job would be to go around different places, helping people share knowledge about ways to grow food in difficult circumstances. So, what we do is needed, it's important, it's fulfilling, even if the business model to pay for it remains eternally emergent. But I take comfort from the fact that we're not alone. Spare a thought, if not your sympathy, for the media empires of the world. They are desperate for an answer to the question, how, selling what sort of content and using what business model, can big newspaper and television groups survive? Now, empires are complex, far-flung, and active on multiple fronts. That's what makes somebody an empire, and this goes for media empires too. But keeping an empire running requires enormous resources, just like Rome. And the problem about the media empires is that today is that those resources are disappearing fast. Half of them have given up trying to sell news. People simply won't pay for it. And ad revenues have also collapsed. But I have a friend who works for Agence France Presse, my last page, who assures me that the one thing that the media companies will pay for, their clients, is what he calls actionable insight. And he got very excited when Reuters recently paid $18 million for a multi-authored financial blog called breakingviews.com. Not news, views. Subscribers are sent very well crafted 350-word text several times a day, which they get on their BlackBerry or whatever. The problem is that however many of these subscriptions to this editorial kind of chunks service is not going to pay for the Reuters and the Thompsons and these big media companies, not in a million years. The NewYorkTimes.com generates, what, $15 million a month in various revenues. That's about $1 per unique visitor a month. But their fixed costs are far, far higher than that. They cannot possibly make money out of $1 per visitor per month. Huffington Post, as a comparison, I think they get 13 million unique visits a month, which translates, given their into 12 cents a unique visitor per month, and they cannot make money either. They can make a bit, but they're just not quite getting over that fence. Now, think of your own position. I'm assuming your fixed costs are modest. You have no huge office building to pay for, no executive suite, no accounts department, no human resources, no private jet, no lobbyists. In fact, if you decided to squat rather than rent or buy a space to live and work in, if you were aggressively to share resources rather than own the tools that you need to live and to work, in that case, your fixed costs can be as near as, damn it, to zero. And I think zero costs is a good place not only to stop, but to stay right there. When your costs are zero, how many multiples of 12 cents a month do you actually need to survive? To conclude, we can talk about whether there are models for being paid for what we do. I don't have any easy answers to that. I do have one intuition, though. Given the fact that there is far more content than there is readerships, is it not possible that rather than looking for ways desperately in which we can be paid to write, our future could be to be paid to listen? Thank you. I think it's partly, I'm just exploring what it means. I met somebody 3 weeks ago who has gone on a listening course. I've never heard this before, and I thought, well, it's a straw in the wind or something. More to the point, I'm rather enthused by some people called Oasis. Have you heard of them? They're a bunch of
Not the band.
No. It's actually a bunch of architecture students in Brazil who 5 years ago asked themselves, what are we going to do since we're not going to be building buildings in this climate? And they set up a kind of curious kind of thing halfway between a charrette and a barn raising. So they go to different places around the world and they have this open space way of engaging a community with saying, well, what do we need here to operate as a community? And if it comes up with a structure, they then build it there and then. And there's like hundreds of these Oasis camps happening all over the place. It's quite extraordinary. And the fundamental at the center of that is not that the Oasis team comes and says, we'll build you a school, like a lot of designers do. They say, what do we need? And they basically facilitate the listening and the emergence of the kind of the wishes of that community.
That's fascinating.
It's great.
In terms of those kinds of democratic events you've done around the world to help ordinary citizens envision their local future, is there one that has been the most successful and effectual?
I haven't done so many because I'm observing people who've got a much better knack than I have at scalability, but the one event that's most inspired me and my friends was Doors 9 in Delhi on food we did a couple of years ago, where we took 60 people who were looking at food systems, what I said as social systems rather than as techno-scientific things, and we said, let's go and look at how does Delhi feed itself? And so we spent 7 days in which during the day we would put our kind of foreign experts into a jitney with 3 or 4 Indian sort of host experts, and they would go to a flower market, a crocus farm, a seed kitchen, or whatever. They'd spend the day there, and they'd come back, and in the evening we'd all sit around saying, my God, that's amazing. And there we had no agenda at all, other than to say, there has to be something we can learn from this context that we don't know in advance.
The one moment in your talk where I began getting suspicious. I didn't reach for my revolver in the old phrase, but exactly. But where you talk about the unconditionalism of our protection of Earth and all that, it seems to me, I'm not sure if that is the most useful way to think about climate change and how to mitigate it, since especially at the large level, at the scaled up level of government choice about carbon tax or building dikes or whatever those solutions are, there are large economic choices about growth foregone and all those things. And so we can say it's unconditional, but of course we live with conditionalism all the time. We allow so many people to die for this kind of energy production, or these, because it's not affordable to make mattresses so safe that nobody will not die. We make those kinds of economic choices with human life all the time. And so don't we need to look forward and say, over the next 100 years, how much will XYZ mitigation of climate change cost, and maybe we can afford that and maybe we can't?
I would want to break down this "we" word, you see. So you say "we" is actually a rather refined group of economists and policymakers and powerful persons who make assumptions about, for example, the fact that growth is the only sensible way to run an economy. And I think that the criticism I would make of myself is not so much that, because I think I don't have a kind of blueprint of the alternative to that. The problem with unconditional support for life is moralism, and it splits people. So that's what you're saying, actually. If you don't unconditionally support life, you suddenly feel bad in some way. And splitting groups or cultures into good and bad is probably not the best way to find solutions. But I actually think that the positive side of that ethical framework is it's a relief not to be dealt with all this transparent nonsense and bullshit that you get from greenwashing companies who say, by changing the label on this bottle, we've saved the mangroves of Florida, or whatever. Yeah. The stuff that we know goes on. And I think that's very stressful to a lot of people, is that the big companies are out of control. I'm not against the big companies, by the way, just that their reaction is, let's make green noises and hope people will stop being horrible to us.
Right. When you talk about new and better coming from the ruins, as we think about our current crises, do you imagine, as a historical precedent, the time between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance, 900 years, or the time after World War II in Europe, where everything was good as new in 15 years?
I've met several people who say the Dark Ages were an underrated period.
Well, and your Ivan Illich thing would
right. And so I think the main thing is that I do not have a blueprint called "that is how you're all going to live," and and it sounds very sort of saccharine and sentimental to say the new being born from the old. I just have a rather strong feeling from the large number of people I meet that they are deeply unhappy and fed up with the thing that is collapsing. So yes, it's irresponsible, and nobody has the right to say breakdown of civilization and all the damage that's going to cause. But it's a crappy thing that we have that is collapsing. And so we have to start making its replacement, not in another big way, but from lots of small experiments.
Well, as you said, 10,000 flowers blooming in this movement.
Yeah, so I experience that in a modest way of traveling around. It is real, that. And so far as I get sort of positive energy from confronting the bad news and the good news, that's where the good stuff is happening. People, they don't know about design or all these words very much. People just say, we want a garden, we want to give our kids better food, or we want to get this river cleaned up, or whatever.
So you're more excited by those things than you are disheartened by Copenhagen or Kyoto?
Yeah, I didn't go, I didn't have any wish to go to Copenhagen. I just think that there's just...
wankers?
No, they're powerless. They don't have, their mental framework cannot adapt, and this overshoot thing is a mental thing as well as a physical thing. By the time policymakers actually understand what needs to be done, it'll be too late for sure. So I don't want to wait for them. That's why transition towns are so positive, because they're not going to wait for policymakers or experts like me or you or anybody else to tell them what to do. They're saying, let's start making some practical arrangements for when the shit hits the fan, whatever that shit is.
John Thackara, thank you very much.
Thank you.